We start this new year 2022 as we ended last year and many other years with the Millennium Tower continuing to sink and tilt. I know that the title of this hearing is about progress, but progress has been going the opposite direction with the perimeter pile, quote unquote, fix.
Hello, welcome back to Building Integrity. I'm your host, Josh Porter, and today we're going to be talking about this hearing that you just saw that video clip from. That was a government audit and oversight committee in San Francisco, and it took place in January of 2022. At this meeting, there was a lot of players, a lot of the engineers involved with the fix, with the design, and also engineers that have been involved in the review and audit of these designs. And then, of course, an engineer with an opposing view, and he's not the only one. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that. But in today's video, what we really want to talk about is the Millennium Tower and this sophisticated analysis that was performed by SGH in order to arrive at this 52 pile solution. And again, I don't say sophisticated analyses in a mocking way. This is actually their term. SGH wrote an article in Structure magazine, and they touted their own solution as being the result of a sophisticated analysis. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at how did they arrive at the 52 pile solution, and now, how are we at an 18 pile solution? And I'm going to walk you through that, and you be the judge on whether you think the engineers involved in this actually did use a sophisticated analysis or if they used some other method. All right. So at this hearing, Supervisor Aaron Peskin, that was the person you just heard talking, he's alarmed at this point now that the design is being changed to 18 piles. This is a huge change because what was proposed by SGH was that they would install 52 piles along the perimeter of Millennium Tower in order to stop the sinking on that side. The theory would be then that the building would continue to settle in the other direction, thus sort of straightening itself out. Now, what happens beyond that, or will the building continue settling? None of that was ever investigated or resolved, really. And so take a listen to this video here.
We should, I assume you originally designed this to be as optimal as possible and did not over-design it. And that the exacerbated rate of differential settlement is what moved you towards a 42 pile solution. Why should we believe that removing 2/3 of your original fix is going to be safe and effective?
So here what he's getting at is that before they went to the 18 pile solution from the 52 piles around the building, they actually proposed 42 piles. And then they kind of changed their mind and they decided ultimately on 18. And so Supervisor Peskin is asking Ron Hamburger, the lead engineer of record for this job, wasn't there some sort of optimization? Wasn't there something done? Let's listen to Hamburger's response.
Well, your assumption that I had optimized the original design is unfortunately incorrect. The original design of 52 piles was selected because I felt that I could safely add new piles at 6 foot on center around two sides of the building and take 800 kips of load on each of those piles without jeopardizing the building's safety. I gave that information to the project geotechnical engineer, Mr. John Egan, who I believe is already present at this meeting, and asked him if this would be sufficient, 52 piles with 800 kips per pile, if this would be sufficient to stop the settling and allow recovery of some of the tilting which had occurred at that time. Mr. Egan and his team went off and did analyses for a period of several months and came back after that and said, yes, that will be sufficient to stop the tilting and the settling. We never asked the question, can we install fewer piles? Frankly, we were so happy that the 52 pile solution would work. When he came back and said that will work, we said good, and we prepared our construction documents and submitted them to the city.
Okay. So there's something interesting, a couple items that are interesting to take away from this video. One, the design was not based on an analysis. This term you'll hear a lot in this video because it's used by these engineers that came up with this solution. It wasn't so much that the engineer of record did an analysis, okay? The engineer of record really just based the entire solution on 6-foot spacing. So he arbitrarily picked a spacing that he thought looked good on a drawing, which was 6 feet. He said, okay, I think we can physically get those installed. That should be enough working space for the contractor to physically install these. And so then that leads sort of the second thing that's sort of hidden in this response is he's sort of shifting blame a little bit over to the geotechnical engineer. He's like, well, I asked the geotechnical engineer if 52 would be good enough, and he said it would be. Well, I mean, they never asked, you know, he even says, and I'm quoting here, we never asked if we could install fewer piles. So what he's sort of alluding to is like, well, I feel like the geotechnical engineer, Mr. Egan, should have told us if we could have gotten away with less piles. We were just seeing if the 52 would work to begin with. So it's a little bit of blame shifting, I think, here. I think to put this, though, into perspective, this is not the way engineering works. And I know a lot of people that watch this channel don't, or they're not, you guys aren't engineers, right? So this isn't how the engineering process works. We don't say, gee, you know, will 1,000 columns hold up a building, right? So for example, like when the Golden Gate Bridge was being designed by the lead engineer, Joseph Strauss, I mean, he didn't simply ask another engineer if they thought 20 towers would work instead of the 2, right? You kind of have to do some calculations. You have to figure out what are the loads that we're taking, and then how do I achieve that capacity? Simply picking an arbitrary spacing of 6 feet on center and then asking somebody else if that will work. I mean, what if it's 1,000 times over designed and over engineered? The other guy's going to say, yeah, that works, right? And that's sort of the situation we actually are in with this design, is that we essentially have a situation where no actual calculations were done as far as determining what is an optimal design in order to achieve our project goals. So then they go on in this process, in this hearing, and you know, one of the things that Hamburger then asked after, so here's what happened. They started installing test piles, test casings, and the building continued to sink more. Now, other engineers in San Francisco had warned that this was going to happen, but I don't think SGH really took that too seriously. So what happened, and as a lot of you may have known, may know from following the news, is that they started installing these casings, they started installing the test piles, and the building started tilting and shifting even worse. So in other words, their repair, their fix, started making the problem even worse. And the fix hadn't even been implemented. It was in the process of being implemented. So Hamburger asked the geotechnical engineer if 20% less piles would still work. In other words, going from 52 piles to 42 piles. So listen to this.
Again, I asked Mr. Egan if a reduction of 20% in the number of piles could still accomplish the project's objectives. Mr. Egan and his team went off and did their geotechnical analyses and responded again, yes, this will work. And again, I never asked the question, how many fewer piles can we install and still accomplish the project objectives?
So essentially what he's saying here is that, again, 20% picked totally arbitrarily, just like 6 feet on center was picked arbitrarily. And he's asking again, and he's shifting blame off to the geotechnical engineer. Hey, well, I didn't ask, you know, and it's sort of like implied, like I shouldn't have had to have asked. He should have come back to me and told me that, hey, Ron, you're way over engineering this thing. Why don't you come down to 18 piles instead of 42? So it's very interesting. But the key point to take away is that the design is still not optimized. So SGH finally realizes that each test pile and each casing that they're installing was making the situation worse. They finally then decided to try to optimize their design. Take a listen to this.
When it became evident that the building was tilting more with the installation of each pile, and while we were exploring techniques that would allow us to install piles without negative impact on the building, I went back to the geotechnical team, Mr. Egan and his colleagues, and asked the question, how few piles can we actually install and accomplish the project objectives? And we looked at a number of alternatives, ranging from the 6 piles that had been installed as of August of last year, through to the original 52 piles. We determined that by installing as few as 18 piles, which we now propose, and by increasing the load per pile, we could still accomplish the project objectives. This now appears to us to be an optimal design. This is the first time that we have ever attempted or tried to optimize the design.
So the project is underway. Tens of millions of dollars have been spent on engineering, have been spent on construction, the roadways shut down, the sidewalks shut down, everything's dug up, it's a huge mess. Now they decide to try to optimize the design. Optimizing the design is important because it reduces cost, it also reduces the impact, it reduces the duration, and then of course, because the fix itself causes harm, it actually reduces the harm that your fix does if you can optimize that design. Listen to Supervisor Peskin's response though.
I'm not sure I know how to respond that you all did not ask that question at the beginning. It just seemed, I never have put myself out as a structural engineer or geotechnical engineer or a specialist of any kind, but as somebody who does all sorts of different projects, generally, isn't that a question we ask at the beginning? I mean, doesn't the client say, well, gee, you could do 100, you could do 18. It just is rather mind-boggling that in the midst of this thing, in reaction to the fact that the fix was exacerbated, the cure was worse than the disease, that all of a sudden you've started asking the questions of what was the optimal fix to begin with. But, and you don't have to respond to that. It is what it is, which is you didn't ask those questions until after the unfortunate fact.
So what Peskin is pointing out is that when he says, the cure was worse than the disease, is that the fix was known to have an impact on settling. If it wasn't known by SGH and the engineers involved in the fix, it was known by other engineers in the San Francisco area and in the California area that were warning the Department of Building Inspections and was warning the supervisors and was warning the project team that doing this fix this way will make things worse. And so what Peskin is asking is now that you guys finally figured out that your fix was making things worse, now all of a sudden it seems convenient that you are optimizing the design. And again, Peskin asks rhetorically again, why wasn't this done? But I don't think he really expects an answer.
Yeah, it just seems odd and convenient that as you face the problem of increased differential settlement as a result of the pile installation, that the pile installation reduced by 2/3 in number now seems to do the trick. And it just begs the question as to why that wasn't what you all decided at the very beginning. But you have asked and I've asked that and you've answered as best you can.
Now, you got to remember that Supervisor Peskin is not an engineer, okay? But I see this all the time in this industry where engineers, we can sometimes get so used to doing things a certain way or thinking about things a certain way that the common layperson sits there and scratches their head and says, what the heck are they thinking? And oftentimes that perspective, that layperson's perspective is accurate and it's valid. Peskin may not be an engineer, but it's obvious to him in this statement, in this video clip, that he feels that engineering was not done here and that perhaps some lazy shortcuts were taken. Another supervisor also questions why 18 piles now, and he asks, is there some sort of trade-off to this?
I mean, is there something that is lost in or potentially lost in reducing the number of piles? I mean, I would assume, well, I have no idea, I'm not an engineer, more support in more places in the absence of anything, any other constraint might be better. And then you discover that there is a constraint pushing in the other direction and you start looking for, all right, well, isn't there some trade-off in going from 42 to 18, or because if not, then it does sort of, then Supervisor Peskin's question, it does seem odd to do more just for the sake of doing more.
Okay, so he's asking, why now? Why the 18? There's got to be some, 18 can't accomplish the same goals as 52, so what's the trade-off? Why are we going from 52 to 18? What are we losing by reducing the amount of piles around the corner of the building from that 52 pile, that original repair plan, down to 18? Ron Hamburger sort of, unfortunately, falls into the trap, which we oftentimes do when we're trying to make an argument or we're trying to debate somebody, for example. And we fall into something called a false equivalence argument. And I'll let him talk, and then I'll explain that a little bit more here.
Well, there obviously are trade-offs, and I will talk to those in a moment. But I think it's important to understand the context under which the 52 pile design was originally developed. At the time we developed that original design, there was a proposed alternative design by another engineer in which he was proposing to install 400 piles beneath the building. And so when we determined that we could do the same thing with 50 piles, that was viewed as so far superior to what had been previously proposed that we did not attempt to look any further.
So what he's saying here is that in his original design of 52 piles, while again being completely arbitrarily based on a 6-foot spacing, and is that enough? And again, think of that Golden Gate, bridge example. Would 20 towers work? It's that same sort of argument. But what he's saying is like, hey, our design had 52 piles, and there was another engineering firm bidding on this or providing a competing proposal, and they had 400 piles in their design. So we have to be, just by basic comparative analysis, we have to be way cheaper than those guys. Except the problem is that these are two totally different solutions, okay? The 400 pile solution was going to be done a completely different way. It was going to be have a different level of disruption, less or more, depending on how you would view it. Most people feel like it would be less disruptive to the public to do that solution. At the end of the day, a lot of engineers are pointing out to me that the 400 pile solution would have been the same cost as the 52 pile solution. So what's happening here is he's using what's called a false equivalence argument. And he's saying, look, compare 400 to 52. Our solution obviously was better, even though we didn't purposely optimize it. Look, it's obviously optimized compared to a 400 pile design, except the 400 pile design is actually a completely different animal. So you're really comparing, the other phrase that we use for false equivalence arguments is basically comparing apples to oranges. That's, most of you guys have heard that before. Okay, the other difference too between the 400 pile design and the 52 pile design that SGH ultimately won their bid on was that the 400 pile design, a lot of people, when they look at that, see that as more of a permanent solution. And the 52 pile design, now reduced down to, we call that de-scoping. You de-scoped it from 52 piles down to 18 piles. This solution was never intended to be a long-term solution. I'll cover that in a future video where we actually dig deep into the design drawings, the engineer drawings, the connections, and all the things. And we start looking at the way SGH actually intends this engineered design to be implemented to the building. But there's no way that anybody could ever say that design was ever intended to be a long-term solution. Whereas the 400 pile design, I believe, in my opinion, was, or at least stood a much greater chance of being a long-term solution. Now, one of the opponents of this whole design and this whole system, one of the people that has been warning the public that this is not really a good design, this isn't a good process to pursue, and that there's a lot of questions yet to be answered that really weren't answered before the work started commencing, is a geotechnical engineer by the name of Robert Pike. Now, he was part of this hearing as well, and he got a chance to speak. And in this clip, he says that the 18 pile solution is not really supported by engineering. And what he's saying is that it's likely simply a cost-saving measure from going from 52 to 18. Listen to what he has to say.
In spite of the previous conversation between Supervisor Peskin and Mr. Hamburger, I don't think this passes the smell test. What is more likely is that the design team is panicking because they're out of time and money provided under the settlement agreements. This judgment that 18 piles is as effective as 52 cannot be supported by engineering arguments, so you have to look for some other explanation of it.
So here's my final thoughts on this solution, switching from 52 piles to 18 piles, and SGH's position on this. doing this midstream, remember, this wasn't like their original design was 52 and then they revised their design to 18. Their original design was 52 and then they started construction. And construction was well underway, which was causing more damage to the building, more leaning and more sinking. Finally, after months of ignoring the tilting and sinking that their own solution was causing, the project was halted and stopped. They have this hearing where they're trying to please let us continue with the construction project. We promise we'll only do 18 piles. And so really the 52 pile to 18 pile midstream change was really just there to alleviate problems that their own fix was creating, which sort of to me calls into question the entire design of the fix itself. Now, in our next video on Millennium Towers, we will look at the design, we'll look at the drawings, we'll look at the way it's supposed to be implemented, and to see if the repairs as they're designed even make sense, and sort of pointing out why I believe it's a short-term solution versus a long-term solution. But for now, I will leave you with these final words from Robert Pike at that January 2022 hearing.
This sequence of events has gone from what at one point might have been written off as spin or wishful thinking to what now can only be described as deliberate misdirection. I say that in spite of having heard my friends Ron and Greg testify today. I agree with some of the points that Greg made, but I'm skeptical about their continuing dismissal of significant questions.
Well, that's all for today. Thanks for watching.